haver branqueamento de capitais. A segunda instituição que nós detectamos são as fundações de caridade, porque sabemos que as fundações é um patrimônio que alguém afeta, né, para um determinado fim, mas depois tem os doadores. E estas doações, às vezes, não sabemos a origem de tais fundos doados, né? Não conseguimos controlar ou ver a origem dos fundos, a nacionalidade dos doadores, o volume de transações que essas fundações, estamos a falar de transações financeiras, né? ou movimentações financeiras, né? Não se consegue muitas vezes controlar o movimento financeiro dessas fundações de caridade. Uma terceira entidade, uma terceira ONG que se pode também trazer aqui, que nós detectamos, são as associações de saúde e educação. Porque muitas delas, muitas associações acolhem pessoas, têm também doadores e às vezes também há essa sociedade de haver essas atividades, porque não se consegue às vezes controlar ou saber se as doações que elas recebem, né, quer internamente, quer externamente, estamos a falar mais de doações externas, né, como é que elas de facto canalizam esses fundos para as suas atividades, né? Não estamos a dizer que elas fazem isso, estamos a dizer que há suscetibilidade de branquear capitais, né? Não sei se estamos aqui a perceber. Bem, segunda pergunta. Evidências de risco de branqueamento de capitais. Que exemplos de branqueamento de capitais existem no setor das associações sem fins lucrativos, por exemplo, ações penais ou investigações? Nessa segunda questão, nós... evidências de risco ou exemplos de branqueamento de capitais, como é que nós vamos ver ou detectar? Desde logo pela nacionalidade dos fiduciários, por assim dizer, também a origem dos fundos, o destino dos fundos, né? O volume de transações e a frequência das transações financeiras e a frequência das mesmas. Então, isso são algumas evidências que podem ser detectadas, para não falarmos mesmo também da ostentação que pode existir. Porque se os membros dessas ONGs, se conhece o objeto delas e depois aparecem a ostentar bens de muito valor, então isso é um alerta, né? É um alerta. Bem, terceira questão, avaliação do quadro existente. Que quadros regulamentares e jurídicos existem em Angola para proteger as associações sem fins lucrativos contra o branqueamento de capitais e financiamento terrorista? Quadros regulamentares existentes para proteger. Claramente, como já se disse, temos a lei de branqueamento de capitais, a lei 5/20 de 27 de janeiro, onde contém uma série de recomendações, princípios, normas que vêm tratar essa questão do branqueamento de capitais. Depois também, a nível de finanças, por aí fora, temos os avisos do BNA que, no fundo, impõem às instituições financeiras uma série de recomendações que devem observar quando há movimentações financeiras, né? Tem que reportar sempre quando há grandes movimentações financeiras e a origem de tais fundos, né? Isto ajuda também a proteger as associações desta. Por fim, temos também o Código Penal porque quando há branqueamento de capitais e financiamento de terrorismo, há crimes subjacentes, ou seja, pode haver aí situações de prática de crimes, então o Código Penal, claro, pune determinadas condutas que associadas ao branqueamento de capitais e ao financiamento do terrorismo. E depois, setorialmente, a nível dos departamentos, né, ministeriais, existe um conjunto de legislações que regulam, tratam questões que têm a ver com essa questão da supervisão das ONGs. Quanto à quinta questão, sensibilização e informação, até que ponto as associações sem fins lucrativos em Angola estão conscientes dos riscos de branqueamento de capitais e financiamento do terrorismo? Sobre essa questão, quais são os riscos? Não sei se estou a responder a isto. Sim. Não, estamos na quarta questão. Na quarta questão. Ok. Supervisão e regulamentação. É necessário uma maior supervisão e regulamentação das finanças e atividades das associações civis em caso afirmativo, que forma deve assumir? Prontos. Os riscos estão identificados e se é necessário uma maior supervisão, obviamente, né? Sempre é necessário, toda a supervisão nunca é suficiente. Todos os países em toda a parte do mundo, de tempos em tempos, têm que melhorar os mecanismos de supervisão, porque sempre existem novas formas de atuação, novos players, novos modos operantes. Então, claro, que a supervisão tem que também acompanhar estas dinâmicas que surgem, né? Então, não existe supervisão estanque, né? Ela é dinâmica, porque por causa desses novos fatores, essas novas formas de atuação que vão aparecendo. E quanto à regulamentação, obviamente existe regulamentação. O que tem que fazer é aprimorar, melhorar, adotar as recomendações e pronto. Temos regulamentação, mas precisa-se, claro, sempre melhorar. A quinta questão, sensibilização e informação. Se as ONGs em Angola estão conscientes dos riscos do branqueamento de capitais e financiamento do terrorismo, sim, tem alguma informação, porque estas matérias do branqueamento de capitais são matérias muito atuais entre nós, porque, como sabe, nós fizemos agora uma avaliação e é um tema que está em voga entre nós, tem que se debater, e as associações, obviamente, sabem disso, que tem alguma informação. E, claro, é necessário mais formação, né, para melhor estarem capacitadas para lidar com essas matérias, ou seja, a formação periódica e metódica é importante. É tudo. Obrigado.
Thank you. That was some really interesting points you made, and I think on your last point as well around only being able to go so far with new threats and, as you mentioned, the modus operandi. I think we can only mitigate the risk as far as possible. Crypto assets was mentioned this morning. That's still a new and emerging environment for everyone, and financial investigators, police officers, those involved in investigating crime will always, in some ways, be on a bit of a back foot and will have to catch up with new ways that criminals will look to exploit a system. And once we learn that, they've evolved, and it's a constant game. So some really interesting points, and also echoing from what the first table said this morning as well. So thank you very much for those points. If we go to the middle table.
Boa tarde mais uma vez, senhor formador. Quanto às questões que foram colocadas, em relação à primeira pergunta, sobre o tipo de associações que podem estar suscetíveis ao branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo, nós identificamos as ONGs que estejam vocacionadas ou que estão vocacionadas à prestação de alimentos, sempre que alguma entidade, sempre que em determinada cidade, província, haja pessoas vulneráveis e com necessidade de alimentos, então estas ONGs podem ser consideradas como suscetíveis ao branqueamento de capitais. Também identificamos as ONGs vocacionadas a outro tipo de apoio a pessoas vulneráveis, nomeadamente aos toxicodependentes. Identificamos também as organizações religiosas, sejam elas cristãs, muçulmanas ou outro tipo de religião. Em relação à segunda questão, quanto aos exemplos de branqueamento de capitais, nos cingimos sobre as associações a nível que atuam na área religiosa. Assim é, pois, deixa-me ver se a terceira... Ok. Assim é, e a nível da investigação, podemos falar aqui a nível do nosso país, em que determinada organização religiosa teve membros que fizeram então participação às entidades competentes, nomeadamente a PGR e outras entidades que intervêm no processo de investigação, abriram um processo mediante queixa-crime, segundo o qual eles tinham elementos suficientes para que indiciavam a perpetração de determinados crimes, nomeadamente a fuga de informação aos demais membros da associação religiosa quanto à fuga de capitais do país para o estrangeiro, em somas bastante avultadas e de forma ilegal. Também notou-se a compra exagerada de imóveis, bens imóveis, e estes imóveis não eram os que serviam para o funcionamento da sede da instituição religiosa, e outros elementos que fundamentaram a investigação, a abertura de uma investigação, o que levou a um processo judicial. E não sabemos, não podemos aqui, a mesa não pode concluir que o processo já chegou ao seu termo, mas este é um elemento claro de investigação no âmbito do branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo. Quanto à terceira questão, sobre a avaliação, se Angola tem a nível regular o branqueamento e financiamento ao terrorismo, nós podemos dizer que genericamente sim. Genericamente nós temos, em primeiro lugar, a própria lei de branqueamento de capitais, temos também o Código Penal, a lei dos crimes subjacentes, em que há aqui um enfoque para vários crimes, como o tráfico de influência, associação de malfeitores, e sabemos que a atividade de branqueamento é sempre em concertação, portanto em grupos. Temos o decreto presidencial sobre a Estratégia Nacional e linhas gerais do Plano para a Prevenção do Branqueamento de Capitais e Financiamento ao Terrorismo. Portanto, estas leis são genéricas, mas ainda assim servem de alguma forma, e por ser uma atividade, por serem assuntos relativamente novos, não novos juridicamente, mas aqui tem sido a nossa base para então nos prevenirmos e reprimirmos o branqueamento de capitais. Claro que precisamos especificamente melhorar a lei de branqueamento de capitais, e creio que é um assunto que está a ser tratado. Em relação, ainda neste âmbito, relativamente à supervisão, nós podemos identificamos o próprio Código Penal, sim, mas também a própria lei do branqueamento de capitais atribui competências a determinadas entidades, os sujeitos, que podem estes, na falta de uma lei específica, então atuar como supervisores. Mas isso não é suficiente, precisamos então de maior supervisão a nível regulamentar. Como é que deveria assumir essa supervisão? O grupo entendeu que devia assumir, em primeiro lugar, a nível de um regulamento, a criação de um regulamento especificamente para a supervisão das ONGs, as associações não lucrativas, e também um órgão autônomo específico. Inicialmente poderá estar sujeito à superintendência do próprio Estado, mas que tivesse integrado nele pessoas com capacidade investigativa, contabilistas, economistas, auditores e, claro, também juristas, para, em conjunto, conseguirem atuar na supervisão das associações não lucrativas. Quanto à quinta questão, se Angola as associações têm consciência dos riscos, entendemos que não, claramente não têm ainda noção muito abrangente, específica do que é o branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo. Aliás, creio que esse é um problema de todos nós, por isso é que estamos também aqui a aprender o que é isto e como deve ser tratado. Em relação, por isso, há necessidade, sim, de informar por meios de comunicação social, há necessidade de formar as ONGs, identificadas elas dependendo de cada área de atuação e localização geográfica, haver uma formação específica para entender, para que elas entendam quais são os riscos que têm e serem, inclusive, parceiros do Estado para reprimir o branqueamento de capitais. Em suma, são estas as nossas respostas às perguntas. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. And I think it's interesting, of all three of your tables, you all identified that it's charities carrying out a religious aspect may be of more of a concern to you from your various different organisations, and there's also the aspect of foreign income, but also the funds that potentially go overseas. And with the case that you were mentioning, which is really interesting to hear around those pastors who may be abusing the charity to buy themselves vehicles and stuff. I mean, that has been seen in many other countries as well, so it's not unique, particularly in religious charities. But I think also the other point that you made was around having specialist trained staff, whether that's auditors, economists, investigators, to be able to deal with those issues, but have them all under one department, and then they can all work together, and you're going to need your lawyers as well to advise on that. So a lot of themes going between those three tables. Tom?
Can I just make a very quick comment that just as you were talking came to my mind, which is about what are the ways in which an NPO or a member of the public can contact the charity regulator, the police, the Ministry of Justice, to raise a concern or make a complaint about an MPO. Because one of the key things in our context that we try to do is give anyone who wants to complain an easy way to contact us. So if a member of the public is worried about, say, how their church spends the money that they receive, we have a very easy online form that they complete, and we tell them online, we publish what we will do if they submit a complaint. So we say that we will assess every single complaint and they will always receive a response, because having the members of the public contact us to raise concerns is one of the key ways that we can gather information about issues in charities and in MPOs. Now, just to expand that out slightly further, there's three main ways that we would do that for the Charity Commission in the UK, in England and Wales. So first, we'd be open to complaints. So again, anyone can complain to us about a charity they're worried about. The second is whistleblowers. So that's people who work for a charity. So in your example, that's what we have there. It's somebody who works for the organisation, is very concerned about it and wants to raise a concern. And what we need to think about is how we protect those people from any possible ramifications of them making that complaint. And then the third method, which I'll talk about this afternoon a little bit more, are serious incident reports. So charities have a duty, a legal duty, to report to the Charity Commission when things go wrong. So if they lose money for some reason, if there is a safeguarding incident, they have to report it to us. Now, following on from that, we have to be clear about what we will do when they report that. Now, often what we want them to do is report to us that there is a problem and tell us what they're doing to solve that problem, and that gives us some comfort that they are solving this, they're coming up with a solution themselves. But it also gives us information and data about where the risks are in the sector. And again, that information is all published and is very open, and we're very open about that whole process.
The only thing that I'd really add to all this is, obviously we've heard a couple of instances where you've mentioned about obviously the case that you've just mentioned around the church. Kind of just as an example, what we would do at the Commission on occasions where we have multiple reports of potential abuse or complaints in relation to a specific sector. So in this case, you could say churches. If there was multiple kind of cases or complaints, we would do something like a proactive piece. So we would try to identify the scale and scope of the problem by using the data that we have to understand and kind of narrow down potential churches that may also be at that risk. So we're fortunate that we have data that tells us which charities and MPOs operate overseas, where they operate, do they move money physically, and things like that. The fact that we have that data allows us to then confine and understand what other charities and MPOs might also be vulnerable for those risks. So from our perspective, that would be something that we're capable of doing. So that long term, you know, obviously we've got a domestic sector review and just had a mutual evaluation, and there's lots of other steps to do, but that's something that is in your power potentially in the future, to have that ability to sit back and understand if you have cases and investigations that are all of a similar vein, that actually can we do any work to understand the scale and scope of this problem, and what can we do to assist and help charities to identify these vulnerabilities and help mitigate that risk.
Perfect, thank you both for those comments as well. So we'll look now at the other three tables and the questions we asked you to consider. So these were on collaboration and coordination, financial transparency, risk assessment, donor due diligence and cross-border activities. So if we can start with yourselves, please.
Mais uma vez, boa tarde. E nós somos do grupo, membros do grupo 5, que a nossa análise está relacionada a partir do ponto 7, ponto 6, e em relação ao ponto 7, o nosso grupo, em 6, o nosso grupo entende que em relação à colaboração e coordenação, como pode ser feito para o governo, o setor das associações sem fins lucrativos, e a nossa compreensão em relação a esse ponto, nós entendemos que deve-se criar um task force, né? Ou um grupo multissetorial e multidisciplinar, de forma coordenada e funcional, onde cada um dos setores assume o seu papel para que o grupo funcione. Quando a coordenação, nós pensamos que deve haver uma instituição autônoma, né? Que tenha ligado com as coordenações do ponto de vista da legislação e organização, com vista a avaliar a idoneidade dos responsáveis. Tanto, criar uma instituição autônoma responsável pela monitoria e fiscalização, acompanhando das atividades das organizações sem fins lucrativos, bem como criar um mecanismo de sensibilização para que não sejam serviço a ser usado para branqueamento de capitais. Em relação a esse ponto, o ponto 7, sim, o ponto 7, o grupo entende que as organizações sem fins lucrativos devem ser obrigadas a prestar contas junto do órgão regulador e, caso em caso de cumprimento, pode ser alvo de uma investigação com medidas sancionatórias e devido às contas que devem ser auditadas. Em relação ao grupo 8, o ponto 8, quanto os riscos de branqueamento, eu penso que o setor tem feito de forma contínua aquelas que são a praxe. Agora, em relação a esse aspecto, quando necessário, também de acordo com a recomendação da lei, né, é feita por uma determinada questão, mas não tem tido constante. Portanto, agora, em relação à diligência no processo das doações, normalmente pela experiência do setor, quando recebe doações, as doações são manifestadas com a dissidência. E o setor recebe também os doadores, avaliam, né, já encontros que antecedem de talas doações. Essa é a experiência que o setor tem. Depois também nós achamos que ainda é um processo de formação e formação, porque na medida em que o mundo está ligado num fio, cada momento que passa, também a capacidade de entrevistar deve ser atualizada, tanto para não seguir, não agarrarmos nas modalidades anteriores. Tanto esse pedimos informações mais atuantes, mais informações dos intervenientes. O ponto 10º, nós pensamos que o setor e o governo da Angola tem um órgão, né? Um órgão representado pelo Ministério do Interior. Através desse órgão, também neste órgão de coordenação, coordenado pelo Ministério do Interior, as questões de transfronteiriças são feitas são avaliadas primeiro, através desse grupo multissetorial, da qual o Ministério também faz parte. Eu acho que, na sua maioria, todos os ministérios fazem parte nesse grupo técnico. Tanto é ali onde se avalia entre a mobilidade das comunidades estrangeiras, as que entram e as que saem. E o mais que também nesse grupo estão lá representados vários representantes das associações ou dos movimentos dos países onde tem maior incidência de entrada e saída. Portanto, esse é o nosso grupo. Chegamos a essa análise e muito obrigado. Esse grupo estão lá.
Thank you very much for those considerations. I was going to mention something on donor due diligence, but I don't want to steal Tom's limelight from what he's about to speak shortly. I think it's interesting, with the table previously, you both mentioned having an autonomous organisation to look at some of these issues. So again, there's shared themes across. So if we go to the middle table, please, table 3.
Muito obrigada. Quanto ao nosso grupo, ficamos com a responsabilidade da pergunta número 6, que é a colaboração e coordenação. Como pode o governo, o setor das associações sem fins lucrativos e as instituições financeiras colaborar para detectar, prevenir e responder ao branqueamento de capitais e ao financiamento do terrorismo? Quanto a essa questão, relativamente às recomendações do GAFI, no que concerne a recomendação 8, o grupo entendeu que nós deveríamos responder com base no vertido no artigo 3º da Lei 5/20, de 27 de janeiro, em conformidade com o artigo 46, também da Lei 5/20, que diz o seguinte: devemos identificar os tipos de organizações sem fins lucrativos que, em virtude das suas atividades ou características, representam um risco acrescido. Devemos rever a adequação das obrigações legais e regulamentares aplicáveis às organizações sem fins lucrativos em face dos riscos existentes. Devemos também identificar as melhores práticas seguidas pelas organizações sem fins lucrativos. Esta é a questão número 6. Quanto à transparência, o grupo respondeu da seguinte forma: para que haja transparência relativamente às organizações não governamentais, é necessário que haja controlo dessas organizações, que elas prestem. O escutador não é, pois, está a fazer confusão mesmo. Na verdade, é necessário que as organizações não governamentais prestem contas, não é, à sociedade. Isto quer dizer que, ao prestarem estas informações, elas seriam capazes, então, de mostrar os recursos financeiros e materiais que recebem e, além disso, também deveriam mostrar resultados e impacto em relação aos objetivos estabelecidos. Isso poderia fortalecer, não é, a confiança do público, dos doadores e das partes interessadas nas ONGs. Relativamente à questão número 8, quanto à avaliação, a recomendação 8 do GAFI diz que a avaliação é contínua. Não obstante, o número 5 da Lei 520 diz que nós podemos fazer a avaliação anualmente também. Relativamente à questão 9, que é sobre as diligências, nós aqui atualmente não verificamos com exatidão a questão de diligências atuais dos doadores. Então aqui nós poderíamos requerer auxílio dos nossos formadores para que, se calhar, com as vossas experiências, não é, passarem-nos como é que vocês fazem, porque a nossa opinião foi de que nós faríamos uma base de dados no qual nós teríamos as ONGs e a partir daí nós poderíamos então controlar quem são os doadores e por intermédio destes é que nós poderíamos controlá-los. Agora, quanto à questão de número 10, o grupo tem a seguinte opinião. Nos postos transfronteiriços, nós temos que trabalhar com o SME, pois nesses pontos nós não temos exatamente quadros suficientes para controlarmos o fluxo de estrangeiros que entram para o nosso país. É daí que existe uma certa sensibilidade quanto aos funcionários que entram para as ONGs. Por isso, aqui se requer também, se calhar, a vossa experiência, como é que funciona, se calhar, no Reino Unido, quando uma ONG trabalha com estrangeiro, qual é a natureza do visto que ele solicita? Um visto de trabalho? Qual é a duração deste visto? É mais ou menos nesse sentido que nós fomos para a 10ª questão, porque nós encontramos aqui algumas debilidades quanto aos postos transfronteiriços. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear those points. I think on your point 7, which you mentioned around accountability and where those NPOs can show what they're doing and the impact of that is incredibly important, and it's something that Tom mentioned yesterday about what our 6 duties are on trustees. It's about accountability. So if you can do that through way of them publishing their accounts and showing what they're doing in various ways of operating, then accountability is key. That will grow trust and confidence in those NPOs because they are being transparent about what they're doing. And also, this is public money. This is money donated by individuals or given by the government to help with various different projects. So it is money that is belonging to the public, and they therefore must show how that's being spent and the impact of that. And by them doing that will elicit more money going to them because they are being accountable and they're showing that they're actually using those for good work. So I think on the point around immigration, I think Tom probably might want to come in on the accountability bit perhaps as well, but immigration and visa controls for people coming in and wanting to work, that's not particularly our area of expertise, and in particular since the UK just left the European Union, we've got various different rules around visas and also around how long people can stay in countries for. However, I think it's it'd be also the opposite way about staff from the UK going to work in other countries and how that is managed. I don't know if, Tom, that's come up in your outreach work before around immigration.
Not too much. Not too much. I think I was going to go back to the point you were making about transparency, if that's okay. And Joshua's kind of picked up on exactly the same thing that I did, which is how do charities or NPOs account for what they do? Now, as part of a charity's annual accounts filing with the Charity Commission, they also have to provide a trustee's annual report. So as well as the figures that underlie what they do, the kind of income and expenditure, they also have to provide a report which is the story of the charity. So what the charity did that year, what its achievements were, what its plans for the future are. And again, the idea is that is published on our website in most cases, so that somebody who wants to donate to that charity can see what the charity's done, and it gives the trustees the opportunity to sell their charity to donors, and again increases that transparency, which I completely agree with you about. What I may do, if it's okay, is I'll disagree with you on the point around donors and a donor database. I think that, as I said yesterday, we collect certain information about donations. So in general terms, we know the amount of donation a charity will receive from a certain country, say. We don't collect information about individual donors. And I would perhaps caution you against that approach. The issue is that if you require all charities to give you information about all donors, they might give you all that information and you're going to have to look at it. Now, for our context, if 170,000 charities did that, we would drown under the weight of donor information and we would, I fear, never get any work done. So we'll come on to kind of donor due diligence and our approach to that. But in kind of very kind of brief terms, the expectation is that the charity trustees will be responsible, as Joshua said, under their legal duties to manage that process. We will step in when things go wrong. So that, just to add a bit of context to how we work.
And if I can just return to the, I suppose, the border controls. So whilst we won't get involved in immigration, although the trustees of the NPOs are going to have to make sure they comply with the legal requirements on that, we do work jointly with our immigration service, our border force, our police, National Crime Agency, so the equivalent of the FIU, and other partners to target individuals leaving the UK ports or coming in, whether that's by air or by sea, and then target them for bringing cash either into the country or out of the country. So individuals will be stopped by the police, they will be questioned why they're carrying money with them. If they say it's on behalf of charitable giving, then we can become involved, and in that case, if they can't evidence that those funds have come from charity and they can't show where they're going in the world, then the police have the authority to seize those funds and detain them, freeze them whilst they investigate. And we've had a number of instances where those assets or those charitable funds have been confiscated as a result because people haven't been operating transparently. So there are other ways we work with our colleagues across government and law enforcement around the borders and making sure we protect the charitable funds that are certainly leaving UK jurisdiction and intended to be spent overseas.
Yeah, just one final point on the borders element of it. I mean, a key part of everything we do is around information and intelligence sharing, and what would happen in the UK around individuals entering at the border and our potential involvement. One of the other avenues would be in the conducting of checks that the border force would do in the UK if anything was flagged in relation to any charity. So if someone arrived in the country and they checked their mobile phone that they arrived in, and they checked that what the border force might do is check the phone, check the numbers, and if they found that any numbers were associated with a charity, they would notify us to say this charity's phone number appeared on someone's phone that entered this country illegally, and then that would give us some information around that, and that would allow us to do more work around guidance for charities and what assistance they can give people, and what's maybe a step too far and what isn't, and it just, that information sharing gives us an opportunity to identify gaps for us, and to allow us to work closely with partners to make sure that everyone's operating within the legal framework.
Thank you. Last but not least, Table 1, if you'd like to give us your considerations, please.
Boa tarde mais uma vez. Relativamente à primeira pergunta, compreender o panorama atual, que tipos de associações sem fins lucrativos são mais suscetíveis ao branqueamento de capitais e ao financiamento de terrorismo em Angola, o nosso grupo chegou à seguinte conclusão. Em Angola, as associações mais suscetíveis de serem vítimas de branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo são as ONGs e também as igrejas. No caso em concreto das igrejas, por falta de um supervisor para essas organizações sem fins lucrativos, acaba por ser uma vulnerabilidade. E essa vulnerabilidade pode se transformar num verdadeiro risco. No nosso país, infelizmente, nós não temos um supervisor único para todas as organizações sem fins lucrativos. Cada organização sem fins lucrativos pode estar sujeita a um supervisor diferente, mas no futuro, se calhar, teremos um supervisor geral para todas as associações, para todas as organizações sem fins lucrativos. E, se calhar, aqui, aproveitar também para depois os avaliadores nos poderem dar algum subsídio relativamente a essa questão. Como é que é na Inglaterra? Se as organizações sem fins lucrativos estão sujeitas a uma diversidade de supervisores, consoante o seu fim, ou se tem um supervisor único para todas as organizações sem fins lucrativos. Em relação à segunda, evidências de risco de branqueamento de capitais. Que exemplos de branqueamento de capitais existem no setor das associações sem fins lucrativos? Por exemplo, ações penais ou investigações. Um grupo já tocou aqui na questão ligada à Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus. Essa é uma confissão religiosa que atua em Angola, que no ano de 2021 foi indiciada de ter praticado crimes de evasão fiscal e branqueamento de capitais. Mas, pelo que sabemos, a questão do branqueamento de capitais não ficou suficientemente provada. É um processo que acreditamos que ainda está em fase de julgamento. Quanto ao número 3, avaliação do quadro existente. Que quadros regulamentares e jurídicos existem em Angola para proteger as associações sem fins lucrativos contra o branqueamento de capitais, financiamento do terrorismo e da proliferação? E se as mesmas são eficazes? Em Angola, nós temos uma diversidade de diplomas que tratam das questões ligadas à prevenção, combate e penalização das infrações ligadas ao branqueamento de capitais e financiamento do terrorismo, começando pelo Código Penal angolano, a Lei 520, de 27 de janeiro, que é a Lei de Prevenção e Combate ao Branqueamento de Capitais. Temos também a Lei 19 1/17 de 25 de agosto, que é a lei sobre a prevenção e combate ao terrorismo. Temos ainda a lei número 1/12 de 12 de janeiro, que é a lei sobre a designação e execução de atos jurídicos internacionais. Esta última lei em concreto é uma que acolhe no nosso ordenamento jurídico as sanções aplicadas pelo Comitê de Sanções do Conselho de Segurança das Nações Unidas. Não é? Sabemos que determinadas entidades são consideradas como... são listadas, na questão das organizações que são listadas pelo Comitê de Sanções das Nações Unidas. Em Angola nós temos a Lei 1/12, de 12 de janeiro, que é a lei que acolhe as entidades, as organizações sem fins lucrativos que são listadas pelo Comitê de Sanções das Nações Unidas. Quanto a número 4, supervisão e regulamentação, é necessário uma maior supervisão e regulamentação das finanças e atividades das associações sem fins lucrativos. Em caso afirmativo, que forma deverá assumir? Relativamente a número 4, nós pensamos que no futuro Angola deve criar um supervisor para as organizações sem fins lucrativos com competência de efetuar sindicâncias às finanças dessas mesmas instituições. Quanto ao número 5, sensibilização e informação. Até que ponto as associações sem fins lucrativos em Angola estão conscientes dos riscos de branqueamento de capitais e do financiamento do terrorismo? São necessárias mais ações de formação ou de sensibilização? Pensamos que sim. O grupo chegou à conclusão que sim, que o quadro atual obriga que o Estado angolano, em parcerias com as próprias organizações sem fins lucrativos, entendam a necessidade de, em conjunto, realizarem programas para prevenção, combate ao branqueamento de capitais e ao financiamento do terrorismo. Ou seja, o combate ao branqueamento de capitais e do financiamento ao terrorismo não pode ser uma tarefa só incumbida ao governo angolano. As ONGs devem estar também neste combate, nesta luta, devem estar também aliadas com o executivo angolano. A número 6, colaboração e coordenação. Como podem o governo, o setor das associações sem fins lucrativos e as instituições financeiras, no caso, colaborar para detectar, prevenir e responder ao branqueamento de capitais e ao financiamento do terrorismo? Sim, relativamente a isso, pensamos que já respondemos. Tem a ver com a necessidade do supervisor ter também competências para sindicância das finanças das organizações sem fins lucrativos. A número 7, transparência financeira. Como melhorar a transferência financeira nas associações sem fins lucrativos para prevenir o combate ao branqueamento de capitais e financiamento ao terrorismo? A nível do nosso grupo, nós analisamos e concluímos que a nível do setor bancário é feita a devida diligência aos clientes, sempre que há transações financeiras num valor superior a 15 mil dólares. Sempre que assim ocorre, há uma transação financeira superior a 15 mil dólares, o banco informa a unidade de informação financeira, fazendo jus ao seu dever de informar, o seu dever de reportar. Quanto ao número 8, avaliação dos riscos. Com que frequência são efetuadas a avaliação de risco do setor das associações sem fins lucrativos? Como é que se realizam os riscos identificados? Relativamente a essa questão, o nosso ordenamento jurídico, mais concretamente a Lei 520, de 27 de janeiro, Lei de Prevenção e Combate ao Branqueamento de Capitais, no seu artigo 4º, prevê duas situações para que haja avaliação. Para a avaliação setorial, a nossa lei prevê que ela deve ser feita anualmente ou pelo menos atualizada anualmente. Para a avaliação nacional de risco, ela deve ser feita de 3 em 3 anos. É o que está previsto na nossa lei de branqueamento de capitais. Quanto ao número 9, diligência devida aos doadores. Esta pergunta, acabamos por dar também a mesma resposta do setor bancário, que diz que sempre que há alguma doação e que essa seja em valores monetários, há a devida diligência ao cliente. E se for uma quantia superior a 15 mil dólares, cabe à entidade bancária, no seu dever de reporte, comunicar à unidade de informação financeira, a UIF, para os posteriores procedimentos. Quanto ao número 10, atividades fronteiriças. Relativamente a essas atividades fronteiriças, nós entendemos que o facto de algumas organizações sem fins lucrativos procurarem ter as suas sedes junto às zonas fronteiriças, por si só constitui um elemento de alerta. Não é? E disse que as organizações sem fins lucrativos sitiadas nas zonas fronteiriças acabam por ser mais vulneráveis a branqueamento de capitais, ou pelo menos a serem abusadas em relação ao branqueamento de capitais, financiamento do terrorismo. Por isso pensamos que, em sede de supervisão, todas aquelas organizações sem fins lucrativas que estejam a trabalhar nas zonas fronteiriças devem merecer uma atenção especial por parte do supervisor.
Thank you very much for all of those responses. I think just to address your first question that you put to us as part of question 1. So around the question around supervisory arrangements and putting under one single organisation, does that happen in the UK? So the Charity Commission is the principal regulator for charity law, so anything that happens that needs investigating the result of that, then that's where we would come in. However, our NPOs will also have other supervisory organisations who will also be doing their own stuff. So if the NPO operates a school, then it's our Ministry of Education which would regulate them for education lawful requirements, so making sure that they're teaching children correctly. If the charity operates a TV station or a radio programme, then it's another government department that's responsible for that, and the list goes on because of how diverse our sector is. So there are many supervisory organisations that all have their role to play in regulating NPOs, but we are the ultimate regulator when it comes to charity law. And also, if an NPO breaches another supervisory's requirements, so let's say there are failings in a school that an NPO is operating, we can take action against those trustees for that failure, even though it's run, it's overseen and managed by another government department. So there will be various different individuals and government departments responsible, but that's why it's a collaborative approach. And when there are concerns, certainly around radicalisation or extremism, and it could be involving a school, we would work closely with our Ministry of Education in order to deal with that. So I don't know if any of you have any comments you'd like to make.
I think the only other comment from me was around the other investigation that you mentioned, so Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, and that alongside the ongoing complaint investigation that this lady mentioned earlier on. it's a good starting point for a domestic sector review, right? You've got a couple of examples, a couple of case studies already that you could point to show that there is some risk. So, I mean, if anything, what I think we can take away from this sort of session is that there's been a useful bit of information sharing already across the different departments, which I think is valuable. The other thing I thought I'd say is I feel slightly sad that this table at the front got a round of applause and a clap and no one else did. So I thought you could all join me in clapping for everyone else. So well done, everyone. That was good. Yeah, so we're going to move straight on to the next session. We have overrun slightly, but I think the breakout table sessions were really useful. So I'm really happy with how those went. I thought maybe we could go through a little bit of the next session, see how far we go, and if you all get very tired and want to have a coffee, we can break and pick things up in the morning. So what I'm going to talk about now is socialising the risk. So how do we share the risks that we identify across government and across the charity and the NPO sector, and then outreach. So how do we do outreach, and how do we make sure that is sustained? Because if we reflect on the findings from the FATF mutual assessment and the interpretive note that goes with recommendation 8, it says that countries should have a sustained outreach programme concerning terrorist financing issues. And if we go back to my jigsaw of effective regulation, which is here, we can see that so outreach to the sector is one key piece, along with mechanisms for cooperation, supervision or monitoring, and investigation or information gathering. So outreach in the FATF context is really seen as a key piece of the puzzle. So just to go into a little bit more detail about that, because this all feeds into how we socialise risk, how we share risk. So it's the 4-strand approach that we take. So we look to raise awareness about risks and about issues through our messaging, through our published guidance, through our inquiry reports, so our investigation reports. We carry out monitoring through records inspections. Now, I'll talk about it a bit more, but that gives us the ability to gather information about the sector, and it also gives us the ability to teach charities when they are not doing things well. So we've got cooperation. So how do we show that we work collaboratively, share information and share those risks? And then the final point, which I talked about yesterday, so I won't go into in brief, is intervention, so where we have a formal investigation and we use our powers. So just starting on outreach programmes. So I think the first question to ask is, why have an outreach programme? Now, to my mind, there's 3 main reasons. We have a programme so that we can first mitigate risks. Now, I see the Charity Commission's outreach programme, so the programme that I lead, as a method of what I call soft compliance. So it's a preventative measure. It's giving charities and NPOs the information they need to succeed. So that's the first reason. We want to mitigate risks. The next is we want to understand and manage any vulnerabilities that we see. So by performing outreach, we go to the charities, we go to NPOs in the sector, and we ask them, we talk to them about the risk that they face, and that informs our own risk assessments. So again, as Ed said earlier on, part of that domestic sector review is engaging with the sector, engaging with charities and NPOs, talking to them about the problems that they face. And I'll give you a case study later about how we do that. And again, that final point, which really is part of that FATF, the FATF recommendation 8 that you need to have is it sustained and is it ongoing? So again, some of the points that were made at the tables I think were really relevant to this, which is that the risks around money laundering, around terrorist financing are constantly evolving, constantly changing, which is why the engagement effort that we have needs to be ongoing and sustained so that we stay on top of those emerging issues as things change. So next, just a quick note about why working with the NPO sector is so important. Just to go into a bit more detail about that. And again, it's very, very similar things. We want to be able to understand what the sector does. NPOs, charities, they can give us, as a regulator, really valuable insights into the risks and vulnerabilities that they see and they face. Now, by working with them, we can also understand whether the advice we give them, whether the best practice that we want them to follow is fit for purpose. Is it even possible for them to achieve? So that's one of the reasons why we try to have that ongoing engagement. Now, that's not to say that we always have to agree on what is best practice, but by having that conversation, we can at least manage each other's expectations. Now, the next point is preventing abuse and ensuring compliance. So again, we work with the sector to help stop abuse, kind of terrorist financing, money laundering abuse from happening in the first place. And having that preventative, proactive engagement should give people the tools they need to succeed and not take too many risks. Next, we're also looking to empower the sector. So we're looking to give NPOs, charities, all the information that they need to be successful. Again, as I said yesterday, most charities aren't large, multinational organisations like Oxfam or the Halo Trust. They are small churches, say, other organisations that are run by people who often aren't finance professionals, who aren't lawyers. So they need help and they need advice, they need guidance. And next is around proportionality. So by talking to the sector, we can understand whether the measures that we're seeking to introduce are going to have a detrimental impact on their work. Because again, as we said yesterday, charities carry out and NPOs carry out incredibly vital work, and we want them to continue doing that. So we need to ensure that the measures that we introduce to regulate those charities don't cause them any unintended consequences. So, what are the key elements of a sustained outreach programme? How would you build a sustained outreach programme? And I thought I would talk about this because I know that it's something that you've been set a target to do. So, again, sick of us talking about this, but first step is a risk assessment. So that kind of domestic sector review, that risk assessment, that's going to be the first point, because you need to know who you want to talk to, right? You need to know which charities to talk to. So first, identify those NPOs, those charities that are at risk. The next is to think about what sort of education, what sort of training do you want to provide. Now, for me and for my team, we'll do various different things. I'll again come on to some case studies. That could be workshops, and I know that there was a workshop run by the FIU last month, I don't know, recently anyway. I saw from Manuela's Twitter feed. So is there a need to do workshops or the training sessions specifically on terrorist financing and those risks? And again, when it comes to the FATF review, what you need to be able to demonstrate is that the sessions have been around terrorist financing. And when you do a session, record that you've done it, make sure that when the assessors come back around to review what you've done, you can prove that it's happened. Then think about sharing information. So I've talked already about engaging with NPOs. Think about the best ways to share the information that you want to with them. You know, it could be kind of a regular meeting that you have with a group of large NPOs, for example, something that we do. It could be regular newsletters that are sent to everyone on the charity register, everyone who's registered. Send them a regular email to let them know changes in the law, what effects changes in the law may have on them. Then we've got collaboration. So how do we collaborate with other government agencies, other stakeholders? Again, think about, is there a need to have a regular meeting between the FIU and the charity regulator so that you can stay in contact, force everyone to stay in touch and develop that relationship. Then effective outreach program, you need to think about feedback and how you improve. So we'll often seek feedback on events and things that we do for charities, and we did one. Manuela and her team did one yesterday. At the start of the workshop, there was a questionnaire on your table to ask you some simple questions about your expectations or about your thoughts on the workshop. And we do exactly the same thing. It's a really good way to measure how effective you are being. Then again, just to reiterate the point, ongoing education. So it should be ongoing. You constantly look to improve. And for my team, the challenge I always pose to them is, do we have a rolling program of events, of workshops and webinars that can show that this is an ongoing piece of education that we are carrying out across the sector? With that being said, how you build the program, what would you do? What types of things can you actually do to get that message across? And again, I've put this in a list because I think it's useful for you when you receive the slides to kind of review it. But the first thing is that we have a dedicated engagement team that I lead. It's relatively small. 5 people, so not very large, but they are dedicated to outreach to the sector. Again, we're driven by a risk-focused approach. So, as we've said over the last couple of days, we are concerned, or we identify a risk with charities that work in conflict areas, in high-risk areas overseas. So, I will ask my team to target workshops, target events at those charities. And again, various formats to do that: conferences, workshops, one-to-ones. And again, the idea there is to strengthen the sector and prevent abuse. Now, just above that, there's a note about faith charity registration. And one of the key pieces of outreach that we do, because similar to that you've identified in the last session, we see religious establishments as being at risk because they have high levels of cash, because they're often reliant on 1 or 2 key people, because they have lots of power and kind of spiritual responsibility. So we do an outreach program to faith institutes that are not registered with us, to bring them into our regulatory embrace, or bring them under our guidelines. Now, the idea with all of these is to strengthen the sector and prevent abuse from happening, increase people's knowledge and increase their resilience. And it has the added benefit that we learn more about the sector, and charities will also build links between themselves. So similar to the way we've done it today, I will often host an event with a number of charities present. I'll mix them up, put them all on separate tables with people from different charities, get them to talk about the risk that they see and share knowledge together. Now, the picture at the top here is just a little kind of matrix that I put together to show the types of written campaigns that we might carry out. So the idea is that we have different kind of types of written guidance from our long form written guidance, which is designed to be kind of enduring, lasts for many years, kind of is subject to review but will not change very much, all the way down to in the bottom corner what we call a regulatory alert. So say there is an earthquake in Syria, we know charities are going to respond to that. We'll do a brief alert, one-page piece of guidance that says these are the things you need to consider if you're going to support or try to help people affected by this. And again, what we're trying to do there is just capture the types of different campaigns that we would run. So what's the role of NPOs in all this? Well, as I've probably said too many times already, it's essential for charities to be able to protect themselves. With so many charities on the register, 170,000, and as Joshua said, 20 staff who deal with terrorism, money laundering investigations. We can't closely regulate all charities. Now, the vast majority of cases where there's a terrorist finance or money laundering concern, there are many basic governance failures in the charity. And as we said, it's more likely that a charity has been set up for good purposes, is run by well-meaning trustees who perhaps aren't particularly effective at the role, who don't know how to run a charity properly. So if they just take some simple measures, establish strong financial controls, make decisions effectively, think about risk, how they manage risk, have policies to do that. If they oversee what the charity does, carry out their due diligence and monitor the end use of their funds, in general, charities will be fine. It's where there's less oversight, there will often be more risk and more harm to be caused. So, socialising the risk. Now, the idea is that we, as a regulator, we want to share risk-related information across the sector, across government, across anyone who may come into contact with a charity. That could be a member of the public, it could be the charity themselves, trustees. What we're trying to do there is create a culture of shared responsibility. So while we are the regulator of charities, responsible for charity law, these issues around terrorist finance and money laundering are bigger than we are, essentially, and everyone needs to be aware of what those risks are, and how, by collaborating together, we can manage those risks and prevent misuse. So it's just so vitally important that everyone understands what the risks are and works together, whether that's government agencies, charities, everyone else. And these are just some examples of how we might do that. So at the top, if you can see that, is a large piece of guidance called the Compliance Toolkit, Charities and Terrorism. It tells charities what the risks are, how to manage them, all the way down to a regulatory an alert. So a news story, regulator renews its warning against the use of cash couriers. So don't use people to courier cash across the border. So this is an example of socialising the risk again, and a campaign that we ran, we run regularly, which is called Safer Giving. So we will speak to the news media, we will put out messaging around how people can identify legitimate charities or NPOs to donate to when there has been a disaster or a crisis. Some examples here. So at the top you've got Please Give Safely, the background being the Ukrainian flag. So that's a campaign to make sure that charities give to genuine organisations that are supporting Ukraine. Now, as part of that, we'll give some very simple, brief messages. So, for example, you can check whether the charity in question is on the Charity Commission's register. And again, we looked at that yesterday. You can look at the register online. You can see their accounts. You can see the trustees' annual report that you talked about, and you can decide whether you want to donate to that organisation. Now, if somebody is just asking you for money on Facebook, say, and they're not on the register, you can then think twice about it. And that's the idea, is to kind of get that very simple risk message across to all the people who might be involved in these sorts of appeals. So we've got Ukraine there, Syria in the left, the floods in Pakistan, and there'll be many others. We run them regularly at Christmas time, for example, Ramadan. So those periods where people donate lots of money, we will look to kind of reiterate that message. Here's another example of a more kind of intimate workshop that we would run. So this is something we call the Working Overseas workshop. So managing risks, responsibilities and legal duties. Run by my team. It's free for charities to attend, and we give them lunch, which they always seem to quite like. And again, the idea is that we'll target the charities we see most at risk. So, charities that work in high-risk areas, charities that are newly registered, say, for example, that may not have the skills needed. We'll send them an email invite to let them know about this workshop that we're running, target them specifically. And again, as part of that workshop, we'll talk about many of the things that we've discussed today and yesterday. You know, we'll talk about financial sanctions. We'll talk about why charities are at risk. Again, to socialise that risk, to make people aware of what the challenges are. They're generally run over a whole day, and again, we'll have generally a group of about 50 trustees or charity representatives. There'll be a mix of, say, lectures, say as we're doing now, and we'll do case studies. So, you know, the way I would normally run that is I would, as a table, I would give you a scenario, tell you that you are a group of charity trustees working in Iraq, say, and give you a scenario to deal with. Say, for example, one of your staff members has given money to a terrorist organisation. What do you do? And again, it just gets people to think a bit more about what the risks are, share those risks among everyone else. Just a final example before I move on to talk a little bit about monitoring and how we monitor charities. Anti-Corruption Day. Now, the reason I flagged this one up is because Anti-Corruption Day is a kind of international event, say similar to kind of International Women's Day or some other sort of global event, and we use that for our own means to get our own message across. So where these events are in the calendar, we will again try to target charities that are at risk with a specific event. So the event in this case, called Working Internationally, Managing Corruption and Bribery Risks, was an online event that had over 2,800 viewers. And again, what we're looking to do is have a constant rolling calendar of these kinds of events. Again, not only to demonstrate to FATF that it's ongoing, but also to make sure we share that information across the sector. So, in terms of socialising the risk, I thought I'd talk a little bit about monitoring. So why do we want to monitor charities? Now again, the first point there is that our monitoring is risk-based. So not all MPOs present the same level of risk. Again, various number of factors that may play into that, whether it's the size, where they operate. Again, we use that risk-based approach to identify who we monitor. So then there's reporting mechanisms. So I've made the point already that I was going to make on this slide, but it's about, is there a way for charities to report, or members of the public to report concerns to the charity regulator, to the police, to the FIU, whoever. Again, what we want to make sure we are doing is capturing complaints. Now, that means that we'll often receive complaints that are complete nonsense, or that are just not appropriate complaints, but that's fine. We're happy to receive those complaints. What we want to do is cast that wide net and gather as much information about charities as we can. Then the use of technology. So, we've talked about that a lot. How do we use our data to take this approach and to analyse things? It could be that we are using our annual return data about donations, the country of origin for a donation for a charity, or where they actually operate. Again, do we use that data effectively? Similarly, are we using online monitoring? So, do we look at open source? Do we look at charities and what they're saying they're doing online? And then finally, another key way to kind of monitor, to socialise risk through monitoring, are compliance visits. So on-site inspections that can provide additional insight into charities and what they do. And I thought I'd just drill down into that slightly to talk about compliance visits and why they're so useful. Now, for the Commission, we will do a number of compliance visits each year with charities. It could be up to, say, 100 a year. So in the context of the size of the registered charity sector, not really that many. But they're really useful because they help us understand, firstly, the operational reality of charities. So we can get an insight into the day-to-day operations of an MPO. And that helps us understand the challenges and risks that they face. And again, we can use those compliance visits to identify some of those potential issues, some of those potential red flags. The Commission now has been doing compliance visits for many years. What that means is that we have a cadre of case officers, of case workers who have done many meetings with charities, and they become very good, very adept at spotting some of the specific challenges that a charity may face. So they understand that if a charity works with children and doesn't have a safeguarding policy, that's a problem, and they can give advice about what the charity should implement. They also help to build relationships. A compliance visit doesn't have to be a negative process. Often we would say to charities, you see this as a health check, right? It's somebody independent coming to view your activities, look at your records, and give you some advice. And it helps to educate NPOs. Monitoring is also useful. It allows us to understand trends, understand themes, many of the things that Ed has been talking about today. And again, we're looking to use intelligence to improve our data and inform strategic decisions about what we do. So again, as Ed said, that risk assessment is constantly evolving, constantly changing. For our context, different countries will be more dangerous at different times, depending on what is happening in that country. And what we need to do is understand what those trends are, what those themes are. And that's where the likes of Ed's team are so useful, because they can, as Ed said, look at a specific topic, do some intelligence work, really inform our strategic approach. That links into the risk framework that I talked about yesterday. And we have our own kind of internal case working system that allows us to kind of capture all that information and data. And all of that is part of our strategic plan. So there is buy-in for that at kind of very senior levels of the Commission, which again is incredibly useful. So, some of the benefits of a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. I'll look at that picture of all those beautiful people in the bottom right. Now, why is a multi-stakeholder approach so useful? Well, again, it enhances everyone's knowledge and resources. It builds that trust, embeds that culture of shared responsibility, which is what we want because the risks are so great. And I put the picture in there because I think this sort of workshop, this sort of event, is a really good example of a multi-stakeholder approach of how we can work together, talk about the issues that we have. And again, we may not agree all the time about what our approach should be, how things are working at the moment and where things are going. But the important part is we are actually talking together and we understand all the different challenges that we face. So this is the kind of example of cooperation that I thought I would talk to you about, which is something called the tri-sector group. Now, it's called the tri-sector group because it brings together 3 different sectors: the government, the charity sector, the NPO sector, and banks. This is a regular meeting, happens say once every 6 weeks or so. That I attend, where representatives from all 3 sectors, so the Charity Commission for Government, not just the Charity Commission for Government, but the Home Office, the Foreign Office, the Financial Sanctions arm of the Treasury, all those agencies that are involved in money laundering and terrorist finance, can then meet charities. So we'll have some of the biggest charities in the world will attend that meeting. So Oxfam, Save the Children. But then we also need to ensure that there are representatives of smaller charities. Again, we think that those smaller charities that operate in those high-risk areas are most at risk. So we need to make sure we hear their voice as well. So there will be a representative for smaller charities, and then the banks. So we'll have representatives from all the big banks, Barclays, HSBC in the UK, to talk about the challenges that they see. So some of the issues around bank accounts, which someone mentioned yesterday. Again, we can talk to banks about that, ask them why they are concerned about charities having bank accounts and what those struggles are, try to work through those problems. And again, we don't always agree. There's often challenging conversations, but that's part of why that sort of forum, that sort of meeting is set up. Now, that meeting is underpinned by, I'd say, an informal contract, which is that it's underpinned by trust, that what we talk about in the meeting in the tri-sector group is confidential, that it's a forum for us to express the concerns that we have without prejudice to anything else. And again, that is really useful because it builds trust between the government, the sector and the banks, which is really valuable. Now, I thought I would talk about some techniques for evaluating all the outreach that you do. So we've talked a lot about the sorts of programs that can be carried out, from workshops to the tri-sector group, so kind of multi-agency meetings. And again, when you come to do a FATF mutual assessment, what they're looking to see is, are you monitoring that program? How do you know it's effective? Now, why do we need to kind of do that monitoring and evaluation piece? Well, the first is effectiveness. So we need to determine if the program is achieving its goals, is it achieving its objectives? Then improvements. So identify areas that need improvements, accountability, make sure we're accountable, and that we learn the lessons from the events that we carry out. So, how can you assess that? Practically, how can you do that? Now, there's a few ways. We've talked about one already: surveys and questionnaires. So, if we do an event, ask people a question about it. Was it effective? Did you learn something? What did you know about terrorist financing before you did this event? At the end, what did you know afterwards? Again, relatively basic way to carry out some monitoring, but is very effective in the context of a FATF mutual assessment and evaluation. But there are other kind of monitoring indicators. That could be the number of charities that you reach, the number of trustees who attend your events. There's a multitude of different things you could think of, and those might include case studies and interviews. So, if we run an event for a group of trustees, a couple of months later I might write to them all and say, you came to our event, did it change anything about the way you worked? Did you do anything differently after you spoke to us? And if they say yes, then I'll write it down and take the credit for it. Again, another useful way. And again, we can use the transparency of the sector, so other information, to gather that sort of assessment and to monitor our programme. So that could be information that we receive from other areas of government. So, say if Joshua and his team were to say that we spoke to a charity who went to one of your events and they still got things wrong, right? So I would think, well, do we need to change the way we work to improve, to close that gap? Now, just to finish off my talk about outreach programs, socialising the risk, I thought I would have challenges that you may face if you were trying to build this sort of program, and then also think of some solutions to help you solve it. So this might not be perfect, but I thought I would give it a go. So challenge number one, that you have limited resources, you have a limited capacity. So again, some of the things that you've talked about a little bit already. There's an MPO regulator, but it's very small. Maybe it's not as clearly defined as you would like. And there's limited resources. So there's no staff to do outreach. There's no funding. There's a lack of expertise. So how do you start building an outreach program? Well, the first step, I think, is things like this. So, forming strategic partnerships with other organisations, like the UNODC, like the Charity Commission, that can give you support, that can help build capacity. That could be other regulators such as us. It could be other international organisations, other stakeholders, and those sorts of partnerships can give you access to different resources, maybe help build capacity, maximise the impact that you can have with limited resources. Although clearly the goal is to get more funding for an MPO regulator. Another common challenge, the diversity of the sector itself. So you'll have many different types of charities, from kind of large international aid organisations that operate in this country, all the way down to, say, the smallest church hall. or village hall. So that sector is diverse in terms of size, structure, even geographical locations. I can imagine that there are some regions in Angola that are extremely remote, maybe hard to contact those NPOs. So how can you manage that? Well, you may have to develop a somewhat flexible, somewhat tailored approach. So carrying out that risk assessment, you identify charities at risk. There may be a case to say that you should carry out a different type of outreach activity, depending on the type of charity that you are encountering. So that was the second challenge I thought I would flag. The next one, lack of trust, lack of cooperation from NGOs and NPOs. So essentially, you try to speak to charities, NGOs, and they don't trust you because you're from the government, right? Which is a common thing that we would encounter. Now, engaging with NPOs can be challenging. They may see it as an additional burden. They may not understand the risks of terrorist financing or money laundering. So a common question that we might get asked is, I mean, you've invited me to an event. What's it got to do with me? So how do we get around that? How do we deal with that challenge? Well, we try to build relationships with NPOs. We're open with them about what we see the risks being. We are transparent about how we work. We are transparent about what we will do when things go wrong. We'll tell NPOs when we are investigating them. And again, we'll communicate clearly about the kind of the work that we do, about our outreach programs. Now, we can also provide kind of some very limited incentives for kind of participation. Now, this could be kind of recognition of good practice. It could be some sort of advice or technical assistance. It could be specific advice or guidance that we write for the charity. Now, again, we want to involve NPOs because it's valuable for them. Make sure it's relevant. And the final challenge, before I just talk about some case studies, the complexity of money laundering risks. So the threat of terrorist financing, money laundering, it's dynamic, it constantly changes, constantly evolves, and that can make it challenging for a smaller regulator to be up to date and to adapt an outreach program effectively. So how do we manage that? How do we solve that problem? Well, first we share information. The same way we're doing today. We talk to other regulators, we talk to law enforcement, we talk to the FIU, the charity regulator talks to everyone. We attend conferences together and training sessions. Again, we talk about the risks that we see. And again, what we're looking to do is create that culture of shared risk, of shared learning, so continuous learning. So before I just ask if you have any questions at this point, just two case studies. Very briefly, just to set out how some other countries do this, which I thought you might find interesting, and the two I've highlighted have slightly different approaches. So firstly, how do colleagues in Nigeria run outreach programs? Well, it's implemented mostly by the FIU. So the FIU are responsible for that, and they've partnered with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, so the Special Control Unit Against Money Laundering. Now, what they have done, which I think is interesting, is worked collaboratively as two agencies to conduct a series of kind of sensitisation workshops. So workshops, events, seminars, conferences that target the NPO sector especially those that they see as closer risk, as higher risk, so those that work, say, in the north of the country. They also developed a number of kind of instances of guidance and best practice, which they publish on their website, and they produce a regular newsletter, which I had a look at, that was really interesting. Again, it was a regular kind of mail-out newsletter that would give information about charities and risk, new laws and legislation. Again, share that risk around. And so the newsletter they produced in June 2022 had details of cash transactions and politically exposed persons. So they're covering a lot of ground and a lot of information. The next is Malta, that I thought I would flag. And the reason I think that this one is so interesting is because to run their outreach programme, especially around terrorist financing and money laundering, they partnered with a charity, so the Malta Community Chest Foundation. And the way that they've done that is to use an NPO, work with an NPO to do that outreach, and again have a slightly softer approach. Bring NPOs in to talk to them with another NPO alongside them, which seems to be relatively effective. Would you have any questions about building an outreach programme, socialising the risk at this point? No? Okay. So if no questions, I will move on to the last session of the day. I think we may all be wavering slightly, so maybe I'll go for half an hour and then we'll have a coffee break. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay. I'll carry on for a little bit and then we can pick this up in the morning. So what I'm going to talk about now is what we call the know your principles. So these are the behaviours. This is the behaviours that we want charities to exhibit. These are the things we want charities to do. And it's a key part of our regulatory approach. Now, as I said earlier on, when it comes to charities and spotting abuse, we'd expect that the charity themselves, the trustees, are the first line of defence against abuse. And these sorts of principles are designed to help charities manage that risk. So that's what I'll talk you through. I'll talk you through those three principles, which are know your donor, know your beneficiaries, and know your partner. Now, just as a recap, I'll just go through a couple of kind of key principles before I kind of go into each of the know your principles. Now, the first is around trustee duties, and again, just to reiterate that many of the decisions that we make about trustees, much of the enforcement action that we take, is based around this trustee legal duty diagram. So the fact that trustees have to act in their charity's best interest, manage their resources responsibly. This is how we hold trustees to account, and I just thought I would reiterate that before I carried on. So the next question I thought I would ask is: should charities take risks? We'll be talking a lot about risk management, and these principles are around risk. So there's two examples of charities here. The first is the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. So it's a UK charity that runs lifeboats, saves people's lives at sea when they are in danger. And the second one is the Halo Trust, So mine clearance activities all around the world, including Angola. Now, should charities take risks? Well, they have to take risks. It's part of the work that they do. Charities will have to take risks as part of their activities. The Commission is a risk-based regulator, and we expect charities to be risk-based as well. We want them to take a risk-based approach. And the greater the risk, the more effort is involved to manage that risk. So we don't want charities to be risk-averse. We want them to understand what their risks are, manage those risks effectively. So we want charities to carry out those vital activities, those vital services. So another key principle, how should charities assess risk? So there's these two pictures I've put up here are two of the tools that we give charities. So the first is the risk assessment cycle. So it is a method by which charities can identify, mitigate risks, kind of implement procedures to stop those risks and monitor how those risks happen. And again, we'll send you links to all these tools afterwards if you're interested, so you can review them yourself. Now the idea with this risk assessment cycle is that it's exactly that. It's a cycle. You know, it doesn't stop identifying a risk. Charities should be constantly identifying, taking steps to mitigate risks, implementing procedures and controls. On the right-hand side here, we've got a risk matrix. So again, just a quite simple method for a charity to assess the types of risk that they face. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the risk being the impact of the risk. Is it insignificant? Is it minor? Is it moderate? Is it major? Is it extreme? Or is it catastrophic? And then what's the likelihood? Is it remote? Is it unlikely? Possible, probable, or highly probable? Now, the idea is that if a charity were to identify a risk that was highly probable and would have extreme consequences, extreme impact were it were to happen, that is a risk that is red. It's a risk they need to take steps to manage immediately. If there's a risk that is remote and insignificant, then maybe they don't need to take as many immediate steps. It should not be the first thing that they look at. And again, they're just a couple of tools to manage risk and how we expect charities to do that assessment. So next key principle, just we've talked about it a little bit already, financial sanctions. So in the UK, sanctions are implemented and enforced by the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. They cover a really wide range of activities and geographies. We apply the UN Security Council sanctions, which I think is the same here in Angola. But we then also have a whole other range of sanctions regimes that we've introduced through legislation. So, you know, those could be trade sanctions or asset freezes, mostly designed to change the behaviour of either a country or a group, or it could be adding that an entity to the prescribed list of terrorist groups, which means that it's illegal to support that group, to give them any financial assistance. Now, I thought I would flag this because one of the key things that we would expect charities that work in these high-risk areas to do is check financial sanctions lists. And then, again, something that I talked about a little bit earlier on, but another key principle, reporting serious incidents. So if something goes wrong in a charity, we expect that the trustees tell us about it. Now, what we say is that a serious incident is something that either results in or risks significant harm to people who come into contact with your charity, loss of money, loss of assets, damage to a charity's property, or harm to your work or reputation. Now, a serious incident can be different depending on the type of charity. So for Oxfam, large international charity, if they lost £50,000, it probably wouldn't meet the threshold for them to report it as an incident, because in terms of their overall income, it is such a little amount of money. Now, a small charity that has an income of £50,000, if they lost all of that, it would be significant, which is why they should report it to us. Now, we have a lot of guidance about serious incident reports. At the bottom there's a link here, so when you receive the slides, you can follow that link, have a look at the guidance that we give charities, and we tell them exactly what we expect, what constitutes a serious incident, and what we will do if they report it to us. So, I'll get through the first principle, and then maybe we'll see where we are and break. So, the first principle, know your donor. So, what's our expectation? Well, we expect that charities should know, in broad terms, where the money they are being given comes from. They should also be able to identify and be assured about substantial donations. So let's go into that in a bit more detail. So what are the key risks in terms of money laundering from donors? Well, the first is the point that Ed and Joshua made yesterday: layering funds. It's a method for individuals who are looking to launder money to layer funds into a charity, to move that money around, try to put it into a legitimate sort of integrate it. The next risk could be from high-risk countries. Again, something that you've all talked about today. So countries known, say, for money laundering and terrorist financing, they may pose a significant risk. Next, anonymous donations, so anonymity. Does the charity know who the donor is? Do they know their identity? And is there a concern if that person is anonymous? Because it could be a method for an individual to hide their identity and the source of their funds. And the final one, which I'll talk about again a bit more in detail, is conditions, because it's something that we see a lot. A condition on a donation, which would be, I will donate £100,000 to your charity, but you will give £50,000 of that to an organisation that I choose. Again, a mechanism to launder money. So, capturing donor information. Now, we talked before, and one of the points that this table made earlier on was around capturing donor information, and whether the NPO regulator or the government should receive that information about donors. Now, for our context, as I said, we don't want charities to tell us the identity of every donor that they have, unless it's a serious incident, of course, and then they should. But while we wouldn't expect them to send it to us, we'd expect the charity themselves to keep those records. So if there was information about suspicious donors, suspicious donations, we would want the charity to record that. In fact, we would expect the charity to record that. That would be their legal duty. Now, here we've got at the left-hand side, we've got small donations. Now, I don't think we would expect that a charity, say a church, would capture donor information about every pound that was put in a donation bucket or the church collection. But what we would expect is if there were larger donations, multi-year grants, especially things that were suspicious with conditions attached, that they would capture that information and record it. Now, what we want charities to do is to take a common sense approach. So we want them to apply some critical thought to what they're doing, and record the information where there's a concern. Again, there's plenty of guidance that we publish about this, so you can kind of read all that if it's useful for me to send it over to you. So why is due diligence, why are these checks so important to carry out? And sorry, my slide's slightly messed up there. Anyway, I'll talk through it. So the types of why is it so important? Well, it allows trustees to assess risks. It makes sure that the money is appropriate. It gives the trustees that assurance that there's no illegal source, and it ensures that any conditions that are attached are appropriate and can be accepted. Again, what we'd expect is that charities record decisions that they make and record information where they've made a significant decision. So, what types of checks would we expect charities to carry out? So, there's many different types, and I don't think we try to be too prescriptive about it, because it will depend often on the type of donor. But these are some examples. Who is the donor? What do you know? What does the charity know about them? They need to check their identity to confirm who they are? Can they do any checks? So, open source checks. Just Google them, see if they come up as a known person. Are they on a sanctions list? Are there any public concerns? Again, what charities have to do is manage their charity's trustees need to manage their charity's reputation. If there are public concerns, it could have an effect on the charity's reputation. So again, if there was a public concern, would any publicity around that have an adverse effect? And how is the money being received? And again, the key point here is record keeping. What we want charities to do is record that information that they gather. Now that means that if things go wrong, they've got an audit trail to prove that they did the right thing, which is again helpful for them if the regulator or an investigator wants to know what happened. Again, this is all about making sure that they take appropriate steps for governance. So, suspicious donations. So, what is a suspicious donation? How can a charity identify that? Now, as I said, in broad terms, we expect charities to know where their money comes from. Now, where that donation is large, whether in the context of the charity, so a smaller charity may consider a large donation to be kind of relatively smaller sum of money, but we do set out in our guidance that we would expect that any donation over the value of £15,000 be subject to further scrutiny and due diligence. Now, how could that be suspicious? Well, again, is the donation anonymous? Is it a substantial donation and you don't know who gave it to you? Now, some people do give anonymous large donations, but it's an indicator of risk and suspicion. And next, is there a condition with that donation? As I said, that could be as simple as I'll give you some money, you give some of it to someone I suggest. But there are other instances of strange conditions that are attached to charities. I spoke to a charity recently who move ambulances from the UK. They drive them to Ukraine to give to paramedics on the front lines. They were asked if a charity could donate, if an organisation could donate a number of ambulances to them, but the organisation wants to drive the ambulances themselves to the war zone. Now, again, the trustees had to assess, was that a condition that they were happy with? Could they accept that condition? And and they decided that they couldn't. Firstly, because they would not be able to prove where the ambulances had gone. Then also, what would happen if one of those volunteers driving those ambulances was killed. Now, once they've done that risk assessment, so is it anonymous? Is there a condition? So the other questions to ask: what is the source of the donation, and is it from an illegal or inappropriate source? So they're the questions that the charity should be asking themselves. Sorry, my slides also cut off on this one, apologies. But there is a list here, when you receive the slides, of types of suspicious donations, which I won't go into because there's many. But again, it could be donations in a foreign currency where there's unusual condition about their use. It could be a donation that's a loan that has to be repaid, something that Ed mentioned yesterday. It could be a donation that a charity is asked to keep for a limited period of time. There's many ways that could manifest itself. Again, another example, I recently spoke to a charity that was working in Ghana. They were given a large donation of around £100,000, and they checked their bank accounts, and they'd actually received £200,000. So they asked the donor, we've had too much money, and the donor said, oh, well, that extra 100,000, we were going to send that to another organisation working in Ghana. Could you just please send that money on our behalf? Again, it's a method to launder money. The charity in this case refused, sent the money back. So, what to do if there's a suspicious donation? Again, check those lists of financial sanctions. Make sure that that's part of a charity's process, and that's the advice we give to charities. If there's a suspicious donation, check the sanctions list first. Then think about whether to refuse the donation. Now, as I said earlier on, a charity, a £50,000 donation could be life-changing for a charity. It could have a really substantial effect on how that charity works, who it supports. But the trustees need to consider whether they need to refuse that donation. And then, do they need to report that to the authorities? So, in the UK, that would be the police and the Charity Commission, and they should do that immediately. Again, that's set out as part of our serious incident reporting guidance and as part of other legislation. So if there's a suspicion of a terrorist financing transaction, the charity must report that to the police. So just before I stop and give you all a really well-deserved coffee break and close for the day, I thought I would talk about a case study. So, there's 4 stages to this case study. Again, a very similar vein to the ones I've discussed. The charity receives a £150,000 donation. Now, there's a condition attached to the donation. £50,000 of it should be sent to another organisation that the charity, that the donor has specified. In this instance, the charity accepted the condition, accepted the donation. They received £150,000. They sent £50,000 to the other organisation that was working internationally. I think in this case in Southeast Asia. And the bank recalled the money. So the bank said that money was inappropriate, it was illegal, you need to send us the money back. The charity was liable for the full amount, but 50,000 of it had already gone to the illegal organisation, and the money had been laundered and had already gone through a layering process. Again, just an example of how charities can be affected in this way. And because charities need money, they need resources, We are in challenging kind of financial conditions, financial times for charities in general. They may be tempted to accept this sort of donation and be faced with this sort of risk. Now, I won't move on any further because I think everyone's ready for a break. But before I do close the day, would anyone like to ask any questions, whether about outreach programmes, about knowing your donors, or anything else that we've talked about today? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you all very much today for your patience. Thank you for engaging so constructively as part of your tables and your groups. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our final day, where we will finish off our talk about beneficiaries and partners. We'll talk about financial controls for charities. We'll have another breakout session where you can discuss another new set of interesting questions. And then Joshua will talk about collaboration and cooperation. But thank you very much, and we'll see you at 9 o'clock tomorrow. 9 o'clock tomorrow, bright and early. So have a lovely evening.